What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today is going to be the first of 3 videos where I will be covering all of the different changes I would make if I was in control of the Druid class for Season 3. Now, this first video is going to be covering the skill tree as well as spirit boons, and then I will be doing a video on the Paragon board, and then we'll wrap everything up with a video on the aspects for the Druid. Also, at the beginning of every video, I will be listing off several things I think that would be great changes across the board for every class that would make the game a lot better for every single player who enjoys Diablo 4. With that being said, if you like this video, you find it entertaining, or you find it informative, or maybe all of the above, please go ahead and like it and comment down in the comments section. It really helps get this video out there. I really want to see a good conversation surrounding the Druid class, as it is my favorite class in Diablo 4, and I think the more community input we have, the better the class will be overall. So let's go ahead and talk about the general changes I would make to the game, and I'm probably going to list these in each video, but I chose 4 things, and not that I don't have a bigger list, I just felt that these 4 things would make the game so much better for every single player who plays the game on each individual class. So for the first thing I would do is I would go ahead and add a movement speed increase toward every level you gain throughout your progression to level 100. And it would probably be somewhere around 0.5% at each level, rounding off to about 150% movement speed when you hit level 100. I think a key component to creating an exciting class or exciting builds is to have a decent level of mobility with those things. And honestly, it would do a lot to make the overall leveling process that much funner from 1 to 100. The next thing I would do is implement iframes into the dodge roll. And this is an idea that I thought was really interesting when I watched the PoE 2 trailer gameplay footage, and something I think that would go a long way in increasing the overall skill ceiling for the player base. Not only that, but it would also provide another option of survivability other than outright tanking damage when you're in dungeons or fighting bosses. And it also would help with those one-shot mechanics, say from bosses like Uber Lilith, that are really hard to see on your screen and can honestly be outskilled through a timely use of a dodge roll. And another thing I think needs to be implemented ASAP is resource generation for all classes, okay? Barbs and druids need resource generation. I know the developers stated that they're scared to add too much resource generation because of overpowered builds that can come from different classes, but guys, you have classes with builds that hit over 1 billion damage, and you said you have no plans on post-season launch nerfs. I think resource generation is the least of your concerns. So please, for the love of God, give druids, give barbarians some resource generation. And then lastly, take all the arbitrary lucky hit values off the skills and just make it like crit chance. Give us maybe a base 10% chance to lucky hit no matter what skill we're using, and then scale it additively. I think this would be a better system overall, and something that would be much easier for players to understand when they're building out their characters. So now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into what you guys are really here for, and that's the Druid skills in Spirit Boons. As you can see here, we are over on the Mobalytics page, and I just have a blank Druid build pulled up so we can go over each one of these skills individually. And we're going to start off with the basic attack skills. So for the first thing I would do for basic skills is I would remove the vulnerability off of skills like Storm Strike and Wind Shear, and I would just allow all of your basic attacks to have a 25% chance to make an enemy vulnerable for up to 4 seconds. Then for Maul, I think overall it's a decent basic attack. I like the first passive here to give you some Fortify. I never have a problem with Fortify generators. And then Wild Maul's pretty decent. I like the 20% chance to knock down the enemies. I definitely feel that passive when I use Maul. However, the one thing I would change would be Fierce Maul. And what I would basically do is take the range and radius off of this and just put it right into the base skill itself. And then I would change Fierce Maul to read something like, increase the attack speed for every successive hit by 5% up to a maximum of 25%. So that would give players an option to add damage to Maul, and I think would go a long way to balance out that basic attack. Then for Claw, I think it's pretty decent. I think I might add a little bit more attack speed here, probably like 20%. And then I'd probably leave Wild Claw like it is. I mean, a 15% chance to attack twice is pretty good. But for Fierce Claw, I think this has more to do with the damage scaling of poison damage. I think there needs to be some changes there. And I would probably give it a larger value overall, so that way when you do poison the enemy, that poison, you actually feel that damage coming through. Then for Storm Strike, I think it's probably the most popular basic attack just because of that vulnerability. But once we change that to fit on all the basic attacks, I think it would open up the overall skill tree here. One of the things I would change is I would give the chance to immobilize probably somewhere around 20 to 25%. I think immobilize is one of the weakest CCs in the game, considering that enemies can still attack you even while they're immobilized, and a lot of the melee enemies have a pretty decent range of attack. I think that Wildstorm would be a much more viable option once we remove vulnerability from the skill. And then you could probably change Fierce Storm Strike to something like a percentage chance to call down a lightning bolt to hit the target that you're currently attacking with Storm Strike. I think that would be a pretty neat way of incorporating more of those lightning bolts into your builds. Now for Wind Shear, I think it's a pretty decent skill overall, especially with the theme of it being like your resource generator skill. I really like the fact that Wind Shear already pierces enemies and that Wild Wind Shear gives you that additional spirit generation for each enemy's hit. And I think that Fierce Wind Shear is a decent way of gaining a little bit more movement speed for your character overall. However, because we would be removing the vulnerability aspect from Enhanced Wind Shear, what I would probably do here with this passive is allow Wind Shear to fracture off of the first initial target it hits into 3 separate smaller Wind Shears that would then continue to hit enemies beyond the first initial target, dealing a decreased level of damage. And I think that would indirectly buff the last 2 passives here, so you would get more additional spirit generation off of your Wind Shear overall, and you would also build up this movement speed buff much faster. Lastly, for Earth Spike, I think this would do a lot better if it was a projectile like Wind Shear. For the passive, I think the 10% chance is a bit low to stun. I would probably change it to something like 15% chance to stun and maybe drop the duration to like 2 seconds instead of 2.5 seconds. Then for Wild Earth Spike, I would probably incorporate the ground targeted Earth Spike into this. So for the second Earth Spike hitting an enemy, I would just give it a percentage value. That way it's still effective on bosses. Maybe say something like 25% chance to hit an enemy a second time. And then what the skill would basically look like is that you hit the enemy with the projectile, and then there's a 25% chance for a ground targeted Earth Spike to pop up and hit the enemy for a second time. Then I would probably swap Fierce Earth Spike into an Earth Spike that explodes on impact and deals damage to enemies surrounding that initial enemy. Now on to our core skill tree, and we're going to address the passive trees first. So for the first passive here, Heart of the Wild, I don't mind this being a max spirit increase. However, I would dramatically increase the value here. I would probably put it something like 10 or 15 for each skill point. Then for Wild Impulses, I would not change a thing. I love this passive. I love passives that are like a give and take. So you increase your core skill cost, but you get a big chunk of multiplicative damage. It's absolutely perfect. We need more passives like this. And then for Abundance, like I said at the beginning, I would give all classes resource generation. So what I would do here is change this to be an additive increase to your base level amount of spirit generation. Then for Predatory Instinct, I would just increase this by 1%, so you would get a 3% increase per skill point. Then for Digigrade Gate, I like the thematic aspect that it pulls from your werewolf form. However, I would just make this a flat 4% movement speed increase per skill point to any version of your druid. So whether you're in human form, werewolf form, or werebear form, you're going to get this movement speed increase. And honestly, it's just movement speed, guys. There's no reason to gate it to just being in werewolf form. However, keep the theme. I like the whole theme going on here. Then for Iron Fur, again, keep the thematic aspect of it, like it's pulling from your werebear form. However, I would just give this damage reduction to all aspects of the druid, whether it be human, werewolf, or werebear. And I would probably increase this damage reduction to 4% per skill point instead of 3%. Now onto our very first core skill, and that's Lightning Storm. And one of the biggest problems that faces Lightning Storm, as well as many other channeled skills, is actually a bug that's persisted, I want to say, since the launch of the game. And what that is basically if you get CC'd, crowd controlled while you're channeling your skill, you'll actually get locked out of moving or channeling your skill completely. And that actually persists for at least a few seconds. It's actually one of the big reasons why I will not make a Lightning Storm build in hardcore, because that can actually get you killed quite quickly. So I hope that at some point in time, and I know they've said they fixed this multiple times now, but I hope at some point in time they actually do fix it, because it is a big reason, like I said, why I will not typically make Lightning Storm builds. But anyway, the first thing I would change directly with Lightning Storm is the amount of targets that Lightning Storm can actually hit, and I would probably double it. And the reason why that is because they've done a lot of work with mob density in the game since the launch of the game, and you've seen how that has impacted Lightning Storm into the late game, because it really narrows the amount of damage you can actually deal with Lightning Storm, unless you invest heavily into Lightning Storm with your aspects. So I would double the amount of enemies that Lightning Storm actually hits. Secondly, I would increase the amount of damage that Lightning Storm does to a single target. So this would help increase the amount of damage that Lightning Storm actually does while bossing, and would make it more viable in those situations. Then for the first passive, Enhanced Lightning Storm, I think it's perfectly fine. It doesn't need to change. For Raging Lightning Storm, again, I would make this a single target oriented passive. Instead of giving you one additional Lightning Strike, which we've already addressed with changing the amount of targets Lightning Storm can hit, I would instead give this a second Lightning Strike to a single target. So what that means is for every channeled proc of Lightning Storm, you will then get a second bolt of lightning that hits the target. Then for Primal Lightning Storm, again, I think Immobilize is one of the weakest CCs, right up there with Slow, so I would have probably increased this chance to proc to something like 20%. Now moving on to Tornado, I think Tornado probably doesn't need much of a change at all, and in fact, it's probably one of the best core skills Druid has, and just by simply giving us resource generation, it's going to make Tornado that much better. And what I would really change with Tornado is going to affect the aspects, so I will cover that more in a later video. Then for Enhanced Tornado, again, another really great passive. Just a simple 20% chance to spawn an additional tornado. You never can go wrong with things like that. That's a fantastic passive. Then for Primal Tornado, again, another great passive here. You slow the enemy directly when they get hit with Tornado, and it's pretty easy to build up that stacking slow, because the damage ticks for Tornado actually proc quite quickly. Then for this last passive here, Raging Tornado, I think it's perfectly fine being a vulnerability chance here. However, I would increase that chance to probably say something like 20 or 25% like the basic skills, because they've nerfed the amount of damage vulnerability actually does when we got into Season 2, and they never really addressed the overall percentage chance to proc vulnerability with some of these skills. So definitely could use an overall increase to the chance to apply vulnerability to the target. Then for Pulverize, again, another skill I think that is doing pretty well right now. I would probably just overall increase the AoE of Pulverize, base level Pulverize, and again, the Spirit Generation change would make this that much better. I think the Overpower every 12 seconds is good here on Enhanced Pulverize. And then for the last two passives, you get a little bit of damage reduction here with Primal Pulverize, so that's nice. Or you can get some stun chance here with Raging Pulverize. So definitely a pretty decent core skill overall, and it's been made better because they've done some nice changes to the Overpower mechanic. Now on to Shred, and this is actually really hard for me to tell if Shred needs anything extra, because the builds that usually utilize Shred throughout Season 1 and Season 2 have been pretty broken. So for the first season, you had a lot of Rampaging Werebeast builds that just had infinitely stacking crit damage modifiers from the aspect, which made Shred do a lot of damage. And then you also had in Season 1 and Season 2 the very popular Poison Shred builds, which are basically, you know, applying their damage through Blurred Beast, and Blurred Beast is basically dealing billions of damage right now. So it's really hard for me to tell whether Shred needs buffs or not. So hopefully they will fix that stuff, and then we can actually address this core skill. Because as it stands, I really can't tell you if Enhanced Shred or Primal Shred or Raging Shred actually need to be changed, because like I said, most builds using Shred are dealing a billion plus damage. Now on to Landslide, and what I will say about all Earth skills that deal damage in this game is they all need a massive buff. And what I would do for Landslide is I would basically make Landslide function like Trample Slide currently functions, just on a smaller scale. So what I would do is I would make every cast of Landslide set up like a 4-column row that travels out in front of the caster, hitting enemies in its pathway. And I think that would make Landslide massively more viable, because honestly, the damage you get from Landslide is pretty decent, especially from the Primal Landslide. I don't think this actually needs to change. I think this is actually pretty good. And as you can see here, they already have it baked in. Bosses always have up to a 10% chance to grant you a Tremor Mote when hit. So more skills need this added effect here, where it has a different effect on bosses than it does on regular monsters. And just by making that change to Landslide where it can hit way more enemies would make this way more better. Then for the enhanced Landslide passive, I would change the Immobilize to a stun and probably set it at like 2.5 seconds, keeping with the theme of our Earth skills causing stun and our Lightning skills causing Immobilize. And then for Raging Landslide, again, instead of it being an immobilized or stunned enemy, I would just simply give it like a 20 to 30% chance to proc an additional Pillar of Earth, because that way it actually affects bosses. And that's a lot of the problem with most of these skills, is they play off of something like a slow, immobilize, or stun, and that actually makes it completely useless against bosses because you can't CC bosses. Now onto our defensive skill tree, and we're just going to go over the passives first again. Ancestral Fortitude doesn't need to change. The resistance changes made this a great passive here. And Vigilance doesn't need to change. So another great damage reduction passive, lasts for 6 seconds, and you can honestly keep this up pretty consistently when you're using defensive skills. Then on to Earthen Bulwark, again, a phenomenal skill, doesn't really need to change. I like the enhanced Bulwark giving you Unstoppable. There's really nothing better than Unstoppable in the game, considering it still has a crowd control problem from the monsters. Preserving Earthen Bulwark is really great, gives you that guaranteed Fortify. I love to use this in my builds that don't have a lot of sources of Fortify. And then the innate Earthen Bulwark, since it's been scaled back and actually scales appropriately, there's nothing wrong with having an option that gives you the opportunity to deal more damage off of a defensive skill. Now moving on to Cyclone Armor. I think Cyclone Armor is a pretty decent skill overall. However, I would change the damage reduction scaling to cap out at something like 20% at 5 points into Cyclone Armor, because honestly, the scaling is pretty terrible right now. I would also reduce the cooldown of the active skill, because all it is a knockback, and I think 18 seconds is a bit too long. I would probably move it down to around 10 to 12 seconds. Then the very first passive in Enhanced Cyclone Armor, again, pretty decent overall. You want to slow those enemies up after they've been hit by the knockback. And I would probably increase the duration of that slow to probably 4 seconds instead of 2 seconds. Then to Innate Cyclone Armor, it says enemies that are knocked back become vulnerable. I would change that completely, and what I would change Innate Cyclone Armor to is, instead of enemies being knocked back by Cyclone Armor, they would be pulled towards your character with Cyclone Armor, and I would probably make it a pretty decent AoE pull. And then last but not least, Preserving Cyclone Armor, I would probably increase the duration of this damage reduction to something like 3 or 4 seconds instead of just 2 seconds. And the really cool thing about this is it doesn't actually proc until you take direct damage. So it's a nice way of adding some damage reduction. I would probably, like I said, just increase the overall duration. And I think those changes would make Cyclone Armor really, really good. Moving on to Bloodhowl, I don't really have any problem with how the base skill functions. I don't mind the cooldown, it's not too bad. And maybe I might increase the overall heal from like 20 to 25%, just give you a quarter of your life back when you cast Bloodhowl. Then for Enhanced Bloodhowl, I would probably change how this passive functions so it would be better for bosses. So I would probably give this a percentage chance to reduce your Bloodhowl cooldown by 1 second, probably something like a 20 or 25% chance. And then you'd probably get much more use out of the skill when you're going up against tougher bosses. Then for Preserving Bloodhowl, I would probably increase this attack speed to 20%. I think that would be perfectly fine. Then for Innate Bloodhowl, I would probably just remove the Spirit Generation and just make this like 20% damage reduction, just to buff up the overall defensive capabilities of Bloodhowl. Moving on to Debilitating Roar, I actually find Debilitating Roar to be perfectly fine. It gives you a massive chunk of damage reduction. The cooldown scales down per skill point you put into it. I like the Fortify and Enhanced Debilitating Roar. The Innate Debilitating Roar giving a slow is cool for its entire duration. I actually don't mind that whatsoever. And then Preserving Debilitating Roar giving you that extra heal if you'd like to increase its defensive capabilities is also pretty good. But 70% damage reduction from nearby enemies is pretty insane. So definitely a pretty decent defensive skill, right up there with Earth and Bulwark for some builds. Now moving on to our companion skill tree for Nature's Reach, because this only affects damage to distant enemies, and I know it does double, but we can't zoom out and enemies are super fast in the end game. I would increase this damage increase to probably around 4 or 5% per skill point invested, and I don't think it would be too much of a big deal here. For clarity, again, I would give Druid's resource generation, so I would make this affect base resource generation value additively and keep the human form aspect of it because I want to push people towards human elemental builds, and I think that's a good idea. Call of the Wild, I think it's perfectly fine being at 10%. I think maxing out at 30% at 3 points is good. Now for wolves, I would make it where you can summon 5 wolves instead of 2. This is especially needed because they've increased mob density so much in the end game. Enhanced wolves is pretty decent. Wolves deal 25% increased damage to immobilize, stunned, slowed, or poisoned enemies. Perfectly fine with that. I'm good with Brutal Wolves giving your wolves an attack speed bonus. However, for Ferocious Wolves, I would remove this passive and instead allow your wolves to poison for a specific amount of damage, and I think that would make wolves a lot better from early game into the end game. For Poison Creeper, I would probably add the ability to summon more Poison Creepers as you put skill points in, so probably like 2 at level 3 and 3 at level 5. Then for Enhanced Poison Creeper, I would probably change this to something along the lines of 2 or 3 seconds. Then for Brutal Poison Creeper, I like this actually. I think a big 20% increase to critical strike chance is really nice there. Then for Ferocious Poison Creeper, I would honestly probably make this some kind of like crazy attack speed buff for Poison Creeper. So you can either have like this huge increase to your critical strike damage while enemies are under the effect of your active Poison Creeper skill, or you can choose to go like a massive attack speed increase to your Poison Creeper, so they're just popping out of the ground, hitting enemies over and over again, applying poison multiple times. So I would probably do something like that just to be a little more creative. Now on to Ravens. So Ravens is probably one of the worst skills in the game, if not the worst skill in the game. I want to think that. I haven't played every single class, but man, they have buffed this thing so many times and it is still incredibly terrible. So what I would do for the active skill of Ravens is I would make the AoE of that skill probably the size of the AoE of the Poison Creeper skill. Either that, or I would dramatically reduce the cooldown and give you charges of Ravens, because honestly, it is absolutely atrocious. So one or two things. Increase the AoE to the size of the Poison Creeper AoE, or reduce the cooldown of this skill to probably somewhere around like 7 seconds and give you multiple charges of this skill, because as it stands, the active skill is pretty bad. Then for Enhanced Ravens, I like the increase to your critical strike chance against enemies that are hit with Ravens. However, I would specify in the description here as to whether this critical strike increase applies across the board if your enemies are hit by the passive or active form of Ravens. Brutal Ravens, I like the additional 2 Ravens. I think that is perfectly fine. And of course, the increase to the passive damage is cool too. And for the Ferocious Ravens, I'm perfectly fine with this having a vulnerability debuff in it. You know, they could probably increase the duration to 3 or 5 seconds. But if they just simply made the active skill of Ravens much bigger or gave you multiple charges, it would go a long way in making this passive that much better. But people would probably still go ahead and choose the +2 Ravens anyway. Now for the biggest change I would make to the companions overall is I would buff the amount of damage they deal considerably. And I mean to the point that they are borderline overpowered or are overpowered for the season, because honestly, they are absolutely atrocious right now. No one really uses them for their active or passive ability. They only use them to boost their core skill damage through the Shepherd's aspect. And I would change the Shepherd's aspect too, but I'll talk about that in the aspect video. But yeah, definitely just buff the companion skills like crazy. make it absolutely possible to make a companion build in Season 3 that is completely overpowered. I'd be perfectly fine with that. And I mean directly overpowered, not indirectly overpowered by applying damage to your other skills. So definitely would do that in Season 3, buff up companions like crazy, and then just nerf them into Season 4 to a better place, because as it currently stands, they're terrible, terrible, terrible. Now for our Wrath tree, for elemental exposure, we have to remember that they, again, nerfed vulnerability considerably. So what I would do here is give these passives massive buffs. So I would keep elemental exposure as a lucky hit, and I would have it read out your storm skills have up to a 20% chance to make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds. And I think that would do a lot, even for 1 point into elemental exposure. For charged atmosphere, again, a passive that needs a massive buff. This thing hits like a wet noodle. I don't know if it's something with the damage scaling, but they definitely need to take a look at it. I would also reduce the cooldown to probably somewhere around 5 seconds, and each skill point you put in it would reduce that cooldown further and would also increase the damage of those bolts of lightning. For electric shock, I like the lucky hit. I like this passive overall. However, I would work in a way to apply this to bosses. So instead of maybe immobilizing when you're attacking a boss, you just simply have that same percentage chance to apply a debuff to the boss that allows you to deal more lightning damage to them. And then Bad Omen, again, is a pretty decent overall passive. I would probably just look at the scaling of the lightning bolt damage to make sure that all of our damage modifiers are applying to that bolt of lightning. Then lastly, for Endless Tempest, I have no idea why they made this a percentage increase to the duration of Hurricane and Cataclysm. I would probably just go ahead and make this a 1 or 2 second duration increase for those skills. And I don't think it would make them overpowered at all, because Hurricane doesn't really hit very hard, and Cataclysm really suffers from the same problem. It probably needs a damage buff as well. Now for Mending, again, I like the theme of the Werebear Werewolf. However, for these passives, I would always apply them to while you're shapeshifted. So for Mending, I would say while shapeshifted, and then instead of the 5% additional healing from all sources, I would just give some value of passive HP regen here. Then for Provocation, again, while you're shapeshifted, and I think the duration of the cooldown is perfectly fine, and obviously Overpowered is pretty decent now. So definitely would keep this like it is, except for while you're shapeshifted. Then for Neurotoxin, I'm perfectly fine with it. However, I would adjust that value. I'd probably make it somewhere around 10 or 15% slow to the enemy, because honestly, enemies are so ridiculously fast in the end game, you really don't even know that they're slow. Then for Toxic Claws, I would probably address how poison damage scales, and then I would apply this to while you're shapeshifted, so Werebear skills also get the benefit of poisoning enemies. And this applies to the aspects as well, because there's a few aspects, and we'll talk about it, where if you could apply damage with your Werebear skills, they might actually be viable. So that's the change I would make here for Toxic Claws, as well as any passive that affects your shapeshifting abilities. Then Envenom is one of the best crit multipliers that we have. Again, you see the icon, it's werewolf themed, so you know it's pulling from the aspect of the werewolf, but you're still applying this damage bonus with your Werebear skills as well. So I just like I said, I love the theme of the Werebear Werewolf, but a lot of these passives would be much better if they would just apply while you're shapeshifted. You can still feel the sense that you're getting it from the aspect of your werewolf abilities, or you're getting it from the aspect of your Werebear abilities, but they make your overall character better. So those are the changes I would make there. Now for the last set of passives, we have Crushing Earth here. It's pretty decent overall passive. However, again, I would work a way in to apply this damage to bosses as well. Then for Safeguard, this passive is fine. I might increase the overall value from 2% to 3% or something like that, but it's a nice way to build Fortify. And then for Stone Guard, pretty decent passive as well. You get that damage multiplier with just 50% of your life being fortified, so really probably wouldn't change that too much. Now for Hurricane, I think the previously mentioned buff to Endless Tempest would make Hurricane that much better, just increasing the duration of the active skill. You could probably bring the cooldown a little bit and buff the overall damage up. For the enhanced Hurricane, again, you could probably increase that slow dramatically, and obviously even increase the duration of that slow. For Savage Hurricane, I actually like this. That 20% less damage is perfectly fine. Then for natural hurricane, I think again we just buff up that chance to apply vulnerabilities to enemies. We can double it or even triple it to like 45%. It really won't make it overpowered because they've nerfed vulnerability considerably. And honestly, having more guaranteed ways to apply vulnerability just makes it that much better of a choice. Now on to Boulder. Now again, by removing the arbitrary lucky hit values and scaling it like crit chance, we're going to get a buff to Boulder overall, but we definitely need Boulder hitting a lot harder, so I would buff up the damage to Boulder considerably. Then for Enhanced Boulder, I would move the 30% slow on it and instead give it a 30% chance to stun the enemies for 3 seconds, and then Boulder would then apply that stun with Overpower no matter what. Then for natural Boulder, this is pretty decent. While fortified, you have a 20% increase to critical strike chance with Boulder. I think that's a good way of increasing the damage as well. I wouldn't really touch that. However, I would go ahead and change Savage Boulder completely. We already have a critical strike chance multiplier from our previous passive. So what I would do here is I would have Boulder explode at the end of its path, dealing a big chunk of damage to the enemies caught up in that explosion. And then I would have it leave a ground targeted AoE that continues to tick damage towards those enemies. And then if enemies are caught in that AoE and they are CC'd in some way, they take double the damage from those damage ticks. And I think that would make a really cool little combination here with the enhanced Boulder passive. So that's how I personally would change Boulder, and I'm sure many other people have some ideas. So go ahead and leave that stuff down in the comments section. Moving on to rabies, again, there needs to be something done with how the poison damage actually scales. So rabies is still pretty lackluster. So again, probably needs a considerable damage increase. Then for enhanced rabies, I would uncap the damage bonus here, and instead I would probably have it read something like increase the damage rabies deals by 10% for every second the target is under the lifetime of the disease. Then for savage rabies, I would have this play into the previously mentioned passive by increasing the duration of rabies from 6 seconds to probably like 9 or 12 seconds. Then for natural rabies, I would just go ahead and take this leftover 50% and just put it right into the base skill. And then I would probably make natural rabies some form of damage multiplier towards enemies under the effect of the rabies disease. Moving on to Trample, I think the only thing I would change about the skill, because I like that it makes you unstoppable, I like that it's a mobility skill. However, I think that I would make it work similar to Boulder in when you hit enemies, you kind of clump them up and move them with you to a targeted destination. Then I would probably change this enhanced trample. I like the bonus damage here, that 150%. However, the second part I would probably change to like a 30%, 20 or 30% chance to stun the enemy for 2 to 3 seconds, something like that, just to play into the trample knockback here, just to pull enemies towards the direction and then bam, you have a chance to stun them. And then for natural trample, I'm perfectly fine with this being something that gives you some fortify. I think it's nice just to have a big chunk of fortify here, helps you build it up a little bit easier. So for savage trample, I'm going to make a big change here, and this is for those players who really love a trample slide build. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove the spirit generation, and I'm going to basically say that when you cast trample, you now move through enemies instead of knocking them back. And this is going to be good for those builds because not only do you get that extra stun that I would add here to enhance trample, but now you're not knocking enemies away from your landslide pillars when you cast your trample during a trample slide build. Instead, you're just moving through enemies and they're going to take all that damage and still have that opportunity to get stunned from the trample itself or from your landslide pillars. So that's the change I would make there. Now for our ultimate passives, for Defiance, doesn't really need to change. This is a really great passive overall. Circle of Life is really useful, especially when we don't have Undying, which we won't next season, and they may not give us another form of healing. So this is actually pretty decent. I might buff this up to 2% per skill point instead of 1%. Then for Resonance, another great way of getting some multiplicative damage. However, I would probably increase this from 2 to 3%, and then that triple bonus would be that much better, as well as that flat multiplicative damage bonus. And then for Natural Disaster, this is a pretty decent damage multiplier. However, I would just remove the differentiation between Earth and Storm and just say that your nature magic skills have a multiplicative damage increase towards enemies that are vulnerable. And that would make it much more consistent across the board, even when you're fighting bosses. Then for the quick shift passive, I know a lot of players enjoy playing around with this passive, so I would probably leave it as is. I might even buff it just a little bit to see what people can do with it. Heightened Senses is really good, gives you that damage reduction against elite enemies, no reason to change it. And then Natural Fortitude, I would probably just give this a considerable buff, maybe 3%. I don't really see anybody pick this, and I don't really know why they would. And outside of just absolutely removing it and changing it to something different, just give it a massive buff, just in case there are players who want to use it. Then for the Fortify passives here, I think the first one's perfectly fine, increasing your Fortify you gain from all sources. Then Nature's Resolve is pretty decent as well. I might actually increase the amount you get per skill point. And then Unrestrained, I've used this passive plenty of times, especially when leveling in hardcore, and this is actually a really great passive, pretty underrated for those looking for a way to not get crowd controlled too often when you're not using some form of unstoppable. So I would leave Unrestrained as it is. But for Thick Hide, I would probably change this to some kind of damage reduction while fortified. So that way you're getting something out of this. I think it's a bit redundant. Whenever you're stunned, immobilized, or knocked down, fortify for 6% life, it's pretty unnecessary. So probably just add damage reduction while fortified here. Probably like 4% or 5% damage reduction. So for Petrify, it is perfectly fine the way it is. They even already have it built in that it works against bosses as well. It CCs all the enemies, and it applies a multiplicative increase to your crit strike damage. So really great ultimate, and something that... And then Prime Petrify, it increases the duration by 1 second. I'm okay with that. They could probably buff it up to 2 seconds, but I'm pretty happy with Prime Petrify. Then for Supreme Petrify, I would probably remove the Spirit Generation here and just add more critical strike damage towards your targets, so that way you can continue to buff up the damage you can deal to enemies while they're under the effect of Petrify. Now on a Cataclysm, I think it just needs more damage. I think the duration increase that we'll get from Endless Tempest from our Wrath skill tree would be really good here, and then obviously that 4-second duration from Prime Cataclysm is pretty decent as well. However, for Supreme Cataclysm, I would change this completely. I would, instead of applying vulnerable to the enemies, I would allow our lightning strikes to strike the same enemy multiple times. And that would help not only increase the overall damage of the ultimate, but also deal a lot more damage when we're bossing. Then moving on to Lacerate. So I would remove this ultimate skill from the game completely. And instead, what I would put in its place is an ultimate skill that allowed us to summon a bear. Yep, that's right. We need a bear, a companion bear ultimate skill here. And it would be a super tanky bear, right? And then it would have an active skill that would taunt enemies to attack the bear that we have summoned. And then for the first passive, I would probably have enemies take multiplicative damage while under the effects of our taunt. And then for the last passive, I would probably have some form of damage sharing between the Druid and the bear itself, so that way the bear is giving us indirect damage reduction by soaking up some of the damage that we would normally take if we were hit instead of our bear. Now, I know you guys are probably asking, well, what about the werewolf skill? Well, what I would do is I would split this icon down the middle, and I would have a half werewolf, half werebear face, and I would call this skill Dire Rage, and you would be able to transform into a dire wolf or a dire werebear for 12 seconds. I would then also increase the multiplier to the damage bonus to probably something like 30%, because I think it needs a little bit more damage, and then I would keep the 20% damage reduction as it is. And then obviously you would still maintain that damage increase you get every second you're under the duration of Dire Rage, and you would still get an extended duration for every enemy you kill. I would then reverse the nerf to the Prime Grizzly Rage, which would now be Prime Dire Rage, and allow you to be unstoppable for the entire duration of Dire Rage. And then for Supreme Dire Rage, I would probably make this HP regen instead of Fortify. So you would gain some amount of HP regen while under the effect of Dire Rage. Now we are finally on to the key passives, and if you guys are still watching, please hit that subscribe button, man. I got 2 more of these videos to make, and this has taken an awfully long time. So help a man out. We're almost to 1,000 subscribers, and it definitely means a lot to me. I love to engage with my community, and the more people, the better. So for key passives, I really like this area being for build specificity. So for Earth Sign Strength, I'd leave it affecting the Werebear. However, I would probably increase the damage multiplier to 30% and the overpowered damage to 30% respectively. Now for Bestial Rampage, I would have this be our companion skill key passive. And what I would have here is that we would just gain these passives to our companions. So our companions would get a flat 25% attack speed increase, and I would probably buff that up to 30%, and then our companions would get a flat 30% damage multiplier, and I would probably buff that up as well to somewhere around 40 or 50%. And again, that's because I just want to overpower companions to the point where they can be nerfed back down into a reasonable place, because as it currently stands, they're absolutely trash. And I think this would be a nice key passive just to gift to our companion abilities. Then for Lupine Ferocity, I would actually rework this to work pretty similar to how the Ravenous Vampiric Power works this season. So I would give this passive a flat movement speed increase, say 20 to 25%, and then I would have on Lucky Hit a chance to proc an attack speed increase based off of our movement speed bonus. And then furthermore, I would allow that this passive actually breaks the attack speed cap, allowing our werewolves to just attack super fast. I think it would be a great way to add a bit of a build difference between a dire werebear build and a dire werewolf build. Just maximizing attack speed, giving us that movement speed, or we get that massive damage increase and we have that nice tankiness from max life. Then for Earth and Might, I think this is a really cool key passive. However, because it procs off of a Lucky Hit, I would definitely bring that chance to proc up to probably somewhere around 15% base chance to proc. And if we hit a critical strike, we have a 30% chance for Earth and Might to proc. And I think that would make this much better. Then for Perfect Storm, this needs a massive buff. This is probably the most trash passive we have. And I would go ahead and buff this up considerably. I would probably still grant it that Spirit Generation, and I would probably send that multiplicative damage increase up to around 30 to 45%. Then last but not least, for Nature's Fury, I really love this key passive and where it's at right now. I would honestly just have them go back through and make sure that all of our damage multipliers are applying correctly to our free skills. And then just to make sure that Nature's Fury keeps up with the other buffs I've made to the previous key passives, I'd probably add a stacking damage multiplier, say like 5% up to a maximum of 15% when we get free skills to proc. And then I would probably add like a 5-second duration that refreshes with each successive Nature's Fury proc. But that's really it, guys. Those are all the changes I would make for the skill tree. Now let's move on to the Spirit Boons. So for the Spirit Boons, what I'm not going to do here is go over each one of these values individually like I just did in the skill tree and tell you the changes I would make up or down. What I'm going to do is to give you an idea. And hopefully, if you guys like it enough and this video gets enough traction, maybe somebody in the development side, I highly doubt this will happen, but maybe somebody in the development side of this game will see it and maybe it will inspire them to do something really unique with the Spirit Boons. So what I would do is I would throw this entire system out. It's boring, it's unnecessary, and there needs to be something more to it. And then what I would do is I would replace each one of these from a thematic part of our skill tree. So this would be like the aspect of the werewolf. This would be the aspect of the werebear. This would probably be an aspect of the elementalist, and then the aspect of the beastmaster. And then each one of those aspects would have a very similar system to what's in place, where there would be like 4 options to choose from that would give you like a basic stat increase. So one for the aspect of the werewolf, the werebear, the elementalist, and the beastmaster that would apply to your character overall. But here's where it would get interesting. When you decide to spirit bond into one of these aspects, a skill tree will open up under that aspect that will allow you even further build specificity. And what you would do is continue collecting spirit offerings to unlock that passive tree for that specific aspect, and those passives only apply to the specific build you're using. So if you're using the aspect of the werebear, it only applies while you're in werebear form. If you're using the aspect of the werewolf, it only applies while you're in werewolf form. If you're using elementalist, it would only apply to nature magic skills. And if you're using beastmaster, it will only apply to your companion skills. I just find this current system pretty uninspiring, and honestly, if you chose not to unlock these boons at all, you probably wouldn't even feel a significant difference into how your character actually functions. But that's really it for the video, guys. Those are the changes I would make to the skill tree and the spirit boons if I had control of the Druid for Season 3. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. What changes would you make? Do you like the ones I've suggested? Or do you think the Druid is fine as it currently is? But like I said, I will be making 2 more parts to this series. I will be tackling the Paragon boards next, and then I will be tackling all of the aspects that we have for the Druid. But with that being said, I hope you guys are having a good day or a good night, depending on wherever you're from, and peace out, guys. I will see you in the next one.